Today's daf is daf Yutes, so we got up to the line 4. Boy Ravash. Yesh shinu l'tzoros l'revia nezek o ein shinu l'tzoros l'revia nezek. We know that in the case of tzoros, which is kocho, according to the chachamim of sumchus, we pay chatzi nezek. But we know also that in shar tam, because it's a shinui, you pay chatzi nezek. So now we pile up a chatzi nezek on top of a chatzi nezek, and we get revia nezek. And you should only pay 25%. So this is the suffix of Rav Ashi, according to the Chachamim, that in the case of hitiza habehema tzroros kedarka, so you pay min aliyah chatzi nezek. And now the Gemara wants to know what's the din in a case of ba'ata bekarka, which is a shinui and a tolda of keren. Shall we say that now you have a chatzi nezek to reduce the nezek to chatzi nezek because of tzroros, of kocho, plus we reduce the nezek to chatzi nezek because of shinui. And when we pile up the two, number one, it's kocho, and number two, it's shinui, then perhaps we can only be mechayevim to pay reva nezek. So the Gemara suggests tifshot le midarava. We can perhaps come to some conclusion about Rav Ashi's suffix based on the suffix of Rav. And this was the Gemara that we had yesterday on Daf Yud Chesav Beis, the boy Rava, yesh hadol l'tzoros, o ein hadol l'tzoros. In other words, if the animal makes a pattern of tzroros, that means on 3 occasions it was mazik b'hatozas tzroros, then Rava vacillates back and forth as to whether or not now it becomes muad l'tzoros, and perhaps the payment should be nezek sholem. Michlal, let's derive from Rava's suffix the ein shinui, that the din that a tam pays chatzi nezek, and in the case where, and that's a case of shinui, and then you pile up tzroros on top of it, and that should therefore reduce it to reva tashlum, reva nezek. So we're not going to accept that principle of shinu l'tzroros to pay reva nezek, because if on the case of tzroros meshunim, then on the first round you pay reva nezek, how is it possible to say that the animal became muad after 3 times to pay nezek sholem? Once the tam pays reva nezek, then the muad would be jacked up to chatzi nezek, and yet Rava wants to jack up the muad to reva sholem. I'm sorry, to nezek sholem, and the Gemara rejects it. Dilma Rava imtim tzaloma Kamma. It's possible that what Rava said when he formulated his suffix, that if there is hadol l'tzroros, then imtim tzalomar, that there's hadol l'tzroros. That's after we come to some conclusion about shinui b'tzroros. So what does it mean? Imtim tzalomar ein shinui b'tzroros, which means that there's no chiv of nezek of reva nezek, but rather you continue to pay, even though there's a shinui chatzi nezek. Now Rava steps in with another suffix that's built on the imtim tzalomar the first, namely yesh hadah or ein hadah, meaning now that you've established that even in a case of shinui, you pay a chatzi nezek on that imtim tzalomar and Rava's suffix. Now, what would be if the animal continues time after time, 3 times to create a pattern? Shall we say that from the chatzi nezek we should track it up to nezek sholem teku? Boy Ravash, another suffix regarding tzroros. Sumchus was willing to say you pay nezek shalom for hitiza tzroros because it's kocho. What happens if after the animal was made tiza tzroros, then one of the pieces of the kli that it broke shoots off and breaks another kli? That's already kocho. And shall we say that Sumchus is moda? He concedes that in such a case he doesn't have to pay more than a chatzi nezek. Mi gomer alocha mukile b'kol kocha. Should we say in one side of Ravashi's suffix that Simchus received a Kabbalah from his Rebbeim that there is halacha Sinai that you pay chatzi nezek in a case of tzoros, and according to this, Sumchus interpreted that the chatzi nezek tzoros of the Hilchos HaGemirale is referring to Koach Kocha. O Dilma lo gomer halacha klal. Maybe he never had a Kabbalah from his Rebbeim of halacha Moshe Sinai of Nizke tzoros of chatzi nezek, and therefore he holds Sumchus that the Baal Behem has to pay nezek sholem, and it matters not whether it's kocho or koach kocho. Take. The Mishnah says, so the animal was in a kicking spree. Or the animal shot out pebbles that broke a kelim. Is mishalim chatzi nezek. And this Mishnah reflects the sheet of the Chacham against Sumchus. The Gemara has a suffix, heichi ka'amar. What was the intention of the Mishnah? And here are the two possibilities. First possibility is that that the animal was kicking, and as it was kicking, it shot out pebbles. Or a regular case where the animal was walking and shot out pebbles. Mishalim chatzi nezek. And this is called Nizke Keren, because Be'ita, we said, was a tolda of Keren. It's Lav Urche. And even in the second case of Tzroris Kurchayu, even though it's Darko Bakach, nevertheless, we have halacha Moshe Misinai that nezek tzroros pays chatzi nezek, and that would mean that the Mishnah is Rabbanani, is a reflection of the sheet of the Chacham that on nizkei tzroros you pay chatzi nezek. O Dilma, perhaps we could say that hoysam evaetes v'zika bibiuta o tzroros machmas habiut mishalem chatzi nezek hakiur chayu mishalem nezek shalimani sumchusi. We could possibly interpret our Mishnah according to the sheet of Sumchus that Tzroros pays Nezek Sholem, and when the Mishnah says Chatzi Nezek, it's because he did a biut, which again is Lav Urche and comes under the Tolda of Keren, and he's Zika Bibiuta, or as a result of the biut in the karka, there were tzroros that shot off, and as a result, it destroyed Caleb. And we pay chatzi nezek. Why? Because in both cases, the hezek was caused by be'ita, and be'ita is a tolda of Keren. And therefore, since it's lav urche, therefore you pay chatzi nezek. Haki urche. As a general rule, he tiza behema tzroros. If it was ki urche, then mishalim nezek shalim, and then the Mishnah reflects the shita of Sumchus. Tashma miseifa. Let's see if we can make a determination one way or the other, whether our Mishnah reflects the shita chachamim or that of Sumchus based on the seifa. Darsa ala kli v'shivraso. If the animal pounced upon a kli and broke it, and now a shever, one of the shards, one of the broken pieces of that kli, shot out and broke another kli. Is the Mishnah paskins that in such a case, So for the first kli that was broken, which is nezek shalem, why? Because that's nizke regel. And for the last kli that was broken by the shard of the first kli, you only pay chatzi nezek because of chatzi nezek tzroros. And therefore, if our Mishnah you would argue is sumchus, ki isle chatzi nezek, does he hold that on the second kli, which was destroyed by tzroros, you only pay chatzi nezek? Can't be. Could only be the chachamim. So therefore, even the Reisha, in the case of nizkei tzroros regilim, a normal way, that's going to have to reflect the sheet of chachamim. B'chitem, and if you'll argue, maybe we should introduce that element that we mentioned earlier of koach kocho. Rishon la taza, and vasheni sheni la taza. Maybe we'll say that the first kli that was broken through that taza pays nezek shalom, and that's sumchus. And the Mishnah wants to say in the Sefer that if the shard from the first kli shoots out and breaks the second kli, then you pay chatzi nezek. And the reason for that is because sumchus is moda that in koach kocho you only pay chatzi nezek, and the second kli is koach kocho. So the Gemara says, you know, that interpretation is impossible. Why? Elahad boy Rav Ashi. Remember, we had a suffix in which Rav Ashi vacillated back and forth. What's the status according to Sumchus of Koach Kocho? Is it like Kocho and you pay Nezek Shalem, or is it a Lav Kocho Domi? It's a separate category, and you pay Chatzi Nezek. Is Tifshalemi the Lav Kocho Domi? Rav Ashi should have come to a conclusion on his suffix from the Sefer of our Mishnah, because we proved from the Sefer of the Mishnah on the second keli that was broken, Mikoch, the first keli that was broken, Mikoch to Behema, which is called Kocho, that Sumchus is moda that you only pay Chatzi Nezek on the second kli. So how could it be that Rav Ashi did not come to some definite conclusion based on our Mishnah? And therefore, the Gemara comes to the conclusion that it's impossible to be poshet the suffix of Rav Ashi, because Rav Ashi k'Rabbanan mukile. Rav Ashi understood that the Mishnah reflects the shita of the Chachamim, and the reason we know this is because the pashtus of the Mishnah dorsal akli v'shibraso mishalim al rishon ezek shalem means the kli on which he was dores, he paid nezek shalom. Val hasheni chatzi nezek haidu al kli shenishbar miatzroros, and that has to be kedas chachamim. Uboile hachi, and Rav Ashi had this suffix here. Should we assume that our Mishnah is hoysa b'vayetas v'zika b'biuta Otzroros ke or chayu, and he pays chatzi nezek? And why does he pay chatzi nezek? It's only because it's shar tam, meaning it's told of Karen, because of biut, which is lavurche, is ha machmas biut. If the tzroros was shadow of not derech ilucha, but rather through ba toberaglov, and now you're going to tell me that you have to pay for koach kocho, then revia nezek. Perhaps we should assume that he only pays revia nezek. Why? Because the shinui in tzroros itself is chatzi nezek, and now with the shinui it goes down to another chatzi nezek, which chatzi of chatzi is a revia, and that's called yesh shinui b'tzroros. O Dilma. Or should we interpret it a different way? That he tiza tzoros machmas biut is he pays chatzi nezek, and that's not midin shinui. it's not a shinui in the tzroros to make him pay revia nezek. And this leads us to the suffix of Rabbi Abba bar Mamel. Boy mine Rabbi Abba bar Mamel mi Rav Ami. The Ami though this says mi Rav Chia bar Abba. Hoy samal leches b'makom she'ef shalom. It's in a very tight spot, and the animal's walking, and there's no way it could go neither to the left nor to the right. Ella imkain minatezet ubat, unless it was a case of minatezet sroros, but not in a way that's normal, but rather ubata, which is unusual fashion of minatezet sroros. V'tiza v'zika, and the tzroros that came shotting off destroyed Caleb. Wow. The Gemara analyzes the suffix. Came on the efshalah, since the animal has no other possibility but to go there. Is therefore, we can classify this case as Nizkei Tzoros Regilim because that's what's going to happen. This is what we can anticipate. Or shall we say that since Ba'ata, that already gives it a din of Shinui, and therefore we classify it under Keren, and Ba'ata, as we said over and over again, is the told of Keren, is therefore we should analyze this case as a case of Nezek Tzroros al Yidei Shinui. Now the Gemara doesn't mention or clarify what's the nafkamina in this suffix. Rashi has two interpretations. According to one interpretation, if you hold Yesh Shinu L'Tzroros L'Revia Nezek, then why is the Baal Behema going to pay anything more than a Revia Nezek? But if we subsume it under regular tzroros, then he pays Chatzi Nezek. Now Rashi has a second interpretation here, and he says that maybe on tzroros regilim, if they become mishuna, then bata behema v'tiza, maybe we can multiply that by three times over, and then we can make it into a muad, in which case it pays nezek shalom. And we're up to boy minei Rabbi Yirmiyah Mei Rabbi Zera, and the names here are very important. The animal's walking in Rishus Harabim, and we know that Shein v'Regel are potter in Rishus Harabim. V'tiza v'zika mao. Now, on the one hand, this is very similar to Regel. Again, I'm taking out the word ubata for the time being. And this is Chatzi Nezek Tzoros. But there's a tzad to say that we should equate this with the din of Nizkei Tzroros to Nizkei Keren. And in both Nizkei Tzroros and Nizkei Keren, as long as it's a short time, you pay Chatzi Nezek. So therefore, just to the same extent that Keren, She'izika B'Rishus Harabim is Chayeves, so too Nizkei Tzroros should have the same din. So you have to emphasize the word Rishus Harabim here in Rabbi Yirmiyah's question. O Dilma, told the deregel hiu p'tura. Why? Because now it's in Rishus Harabim. and regel is only chayav in Rishus HaNizak, not in Rishus HaRabim. Amalei, Rav Zera responds to Rav Yirmiyah, Mistavra told her to carry it, and therefore he should be part of Rishus HaRabim. Now, if we come to the conclusion that Nizkei Tzroros is part of Rishus HaRabim, then we understand another additional question that Rav Yirmiyah asked Rav Zera. He tiza Rishus HaRabim v'zika Rishus HaYochid. This is what we call Akira and Anocha. Now, the animal was situated in Rishus HaRabim, but the hezek actually took place in a Rishus HaYochid because the Tzroros shot out from the Rishus HaRabim into the Rishus HaYochid. Mal. Should we determine halacha based on the makom hataza, and that would make it into tzroros, and your potur? Or shall we say, let's look at the place where the nezek actually took place? And therefore chayeves. Amalei, so Reb Zera responds, and he says, Akira ein kan, hanochi yesh kan. There was no Akira. Why? Because we're talking about Tzroros and Rishus HaRabim. Tzroros is regel, and there's no chiyuv tashlumei nezek in regel and Rishus HaRabim. So now Rabbi Yirmiyah comes back and asks a kasha on Reb Zera. Esvei. We have a price that says, Hoysam aleches, baderech, v'tiza. So it means even if the hezek took place in Rishus HaRabim, my love Rishus HaRabim v'zika, he tiza Rishus HaRabim v'zika Rishus HaRabim, everything took place comfortably in Rishus HaRabim. And not only was the Akira Rishus HaRabim, but the nezek befall was also in Rishus HaRabim. So we see clearly from this price that Yechayev on Nizkei Tzroros Rishus HaRabim. In other words, it has a status similar to the Chatzi Nezek of a Shor Tam. And the Gemara says, Lo. So this is Reb Zera speaking. The Brisa is not talking about this case. It's Hitiza Rishus HaRabim, Zika Rishus HaYochid. So Rabbi Zera responds the following: Lo, that's not the case of the Brisa. What's the scenario of the Brisa? He tiza b'rishus HaRabim, zika b'rishus HaYochid. So then once again, we get into the same problem of the Akira b'makom p'tur in Rishus HaRabim. And even though the Hezek before was in Rishus HaYochid, which should be Machayev him, but the Gemara says, Ha'amr Akira ein kan, hanocha ein kan. You told me, and this is the kasha that Rabbi Yirmiyah is objecting to Rabbi Zera, that if there was no Akira to be Machayev, because the Akira was in Rishus HaRabim and Shein v'regel apot in Rishus HaRabim, then there's no Hanocha. Amalei Hajibi. Rabbi Zera says, I retract my original statement, and now I hold that there's no P'tur in that case for the fact that the Nezek started or began in Rishus HaRabim, because the ultimate final hezek befall was in Rishus HaYochid, and therefore he's chai. Gemara asks another kasha on Rav Zera. Esvei, we learned in our Mishnah, Dorsa al hakli ushvarto, v'nofel hashem al hakli acher ushvaro, al arisha mishalim nezek sholim, al ha'achar mishalim chatzi nezek. So on the first kli, he pays like regel, nezek sholim. On the second, it's toros, he pays chatzi nezek, v'toni Allah. And the Brisa comments, or what's the word I want to use? The Brisa qualifies. When do we say that on the first kli he pays nezek shalom, and on the second one he pays chatzi nezek? That's b'rishus hanizak. because the hezek took place in Rishus HaNiza. But says the Brisa of Rishus HaRabim, if the hezek took place in Rishus HaRabim, ala Rishon Petura, he doesn't pay at all. Now this is a case of Nizkei Regel, and Regel is Potter Rishus HaRabim. Yala Achron, he pays like Tzoros, Chayeves Chatzi Nezek. So Gemara says, my love, isn't the Brisa addressing the following scenario where he teased of Rishus HaRabim, v'yizika Rishus HaRabim? Everything took place in Rishus HaRabim. So we see from this Brisa that you're chayav in Nizkei Tzoros even in Rishus HaRabim, which means that we treat it like Karen. And Rabbi Zera answers, lo, the Brisa is not addressing that scenario, but rather he teased of Rishus HaRabim v'yizika Rishus HaYachid. So once again, we get into the whole scenario of Akira and Anocha, meaning the Akira was in Rishus Petur, the Hanocha, meaning the ultimate Hezek, took place in Rishus HaYachid, and in this case, even though the Hataza was Rishus HaRabim, since the Hezek was Rishus HaYachid, therefore you should be chayav. Since the Akira was Rishus HaRabim, how can you be mechayev him for Rishus HaYachid when the Hezek took place Rishus HaYachid should be part of Amalei? Reb Zera responds, Hadribi. Once again, I changed my opinion and I retracted my original statement, and therefore I hold there's no Ptur unless the Nezek itself happened to Rishus HaRabim. But if the Maisa Toza took place in Rishus HaRabim, but the Hezek took place in Rishus HaYachid, he's chayav. Frek the Gemara Eini. Now I have an additional kasha on Reb Zera. Is it possible to say that there's no chiyuv of Nizkei Tzroros in Rishus HaRabim? And here we're going to introduce Rabbi Yochanan,